How's everyone doing today? Good? That's good. That's good to know in this not quite frigid weather, but better than the weekend, I would say. Anyway, thank you all for coming out here. Again, my name's Ryan Fabianski. I'll be your host. And today's episode of MadTalk is titled Genocide, Human Rights, Madison, Acting Locally and Thinking Globally in 21st Century America. Take it away, Mr. Bernich.
Thank you, Ryan. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Good morning. When Mr. Coviello asked me to come up with a good idea to talk to Madison students about, frankly, I didn't have any. But I thought about things that I started to just think about things I'm concerned about, things that bother me, things that I know a little bit about. So I chose on this rather jury topic, genocide, human rights, and Madison, not so much as this is what's going on, but this is what's going on and what you guys can do about it. Because we're here in Madison, New Jersey. We are relatively safe and sound. And that's good. I'm not trying to say that. No one should go and buy an AK and go over to Syria and right some wrongs. That's not what we're talking about here. But there are some pretty bad things going on in the world, and I think they need addressing, and I think they need to be recognized. And that's what I decided to do my talk about. So before I begin, please understand that some of what I say may sound very political, especially in today's charged political climate. It's an election year. Almost you can't say anything without having some sort of, Republican Democrat ism to it. It would be a mistake to try to view it through those lenses, because these problems go on regardless of American elections, and regardless of who our leaders are. So try not to say, oh, that's clearly an Obama argument, or that's clearly a Republican argument. It's neither. Today I try to make a human argument, and that's kind of where I come from. And I think we need to start with the 20th century, okay? The 20th century was arguably one of the most violent and horrific centuries in history, as far as we know. If you look at the world wars, if you look at the human tragedies that marked each and every decade, you will see a century where it was very difficult to be a human being just trying to get by and doing your job and living your life and pursuing whatever your pursuits may be, peace, prosperity, happiness. Genocide, again, it doesn't touch us here, yet it does. And it's one of those things like genocide. Oh, we're talking about the Holocaust, are we? Well, sure. But if you look, and I threw this together quickly, there has been a genocide in every decade of the 20th century. Some of them are big, some of them are small, but we're not talking numbers. It doesn't matter, the amount, the loss of human life. Again, it would be a mistake for us to try to think in those terms. Oh, this one was worse than that one. We don't compare human pain here. We need to just say, oh, they're all bad, and have it at that way. And you can see, and some of them are going to be familiar. I feel like many people know about Armenia. Of course, we know about the Holocaust. Hopefully, you guys know the more recent ones: Serbia and Bosnia, Rwanda in the 90s, and most recently Darfur and Sudan in our last decade. But you'll see others. And you start to get a little sober, like this is human behavior. We do this a lot, where we will decide that, okay, it's time to wipe out another group of human beings purely on some external criteria, whether it's color or religion or whatever it might be. You might say, well, Darfur, Sudan, that's over, right? Unfortunately, it's not. There's a group known as Genocide Watch out there that is, this is what they do. They monitor the international community for events like this. Today, in February of 2016, there are 5 nations right now listed as genocide emergency, which means it is happening right now. People are being killed for whatever arbitrary reason that it is, because they are powerless, because they are perceived as different, because they live under a government or a regime that doesn't value them as, for their differences, but because they are not part of the majority or the same as they wanted. And one other country, Burundi, is listed as Genocide Watch, which means there are conditions there where it could be imminent. It's hard to know. We're not there. But that's the type of thing that's going on today. So how did we get here? Well, genocide is one of those things. It's the only act of war, and these all happen during acts of war. It's the only act if I surrender to you, if we're in a fight, if we are in war and I surrender to you, it stops. If we are in a genocidal act and I surrender to you, the genocide continues. In fact, it hastens. So you really need to look at these things as the victims, whatever population they are, to a certain extent, I don't want to say powerless, but at a certain point, they can't do anything about it. In fact, Genocide Watch, the United Nations, many other groups have said really the only way to stop one of these things is massive military force, which is awfully tough to think about. So where do we start? Well, how did it get to this point? How come we keep doing this? Many people will often think about the Holocaust, and perhaps that's where I would like to start today. The Holocaust, which was a horrific event, as you all know, after it ended, after World War II was over, the rallying cry among the world was never again. Never again will we allow this horrific event to happen. And for those who, I'll admit, I want to remind you how horrific it is. Many people are familiar with the ovens that were used to cremate bodies in the various camps. But many people, and I suspect many of you, are not as familiar of what the Holocaust looked like before they moved to the ovens, which was simply mass shootings of millions of people. And there we have a German soldier shooting a woman who's holding her child. Mass shootings, day after day, after hour. That's what the Holocaust looked like first. It was only once the Nazis said, hey, there must be a quicker way, a more efficient way, that do we start to see this other mechanized, much less personal method of killing. So we have this horrific event, the Holocaust, and it finally ends. World War II ends. We go after the criminals who did this, and the world community says, never again, absolutely not. This will not happen on my watch. And I suppose we should be happy with that idea, because it's a good one. It's worthy of pursuing. What they did in 1944, a Polish lawyer by the name of Raphael Lemkin said, this requires a different description. Genocide it was a new word. It was a new crime. There was no such thing. It was not in our vernacular as human beings. Genocide was created as a word, as a term, as a crime. In 1944, accepted in 1948 in the Genocide Convention of the United Nations. And they said, look, we have to define this thing because somehow crimes against humanity, mass murder, these don't capture what has been going on. And you can see here, it's defined, and it's good to have it. It's a crime defined as any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such, killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction, in whole or in part, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, and lastly, forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. The idea is not only to kill the people, but to kill the culture. So now we have a definition. we have rules, right? And that's a good thing. Excuse me, I've got my, it's a lot to memorize here. So, you know, well, one would say, like, all right, so great, done, problem solved, never again, right? We've got a definition, we've got a crime, all we have to do is find the people who are going to commit this crime and be done with it, right? Problem solved. Well, that's fine, but humanity doesn't follow the rules all the time. And perhaps that's why we should care. Humanity, it's just us. It's just this planet, it's just our humanity, and in spite of all the divisions in our mind and our politics, we have a lot more in common with each other than we often remember. And so what I'm talking about here sometimes transcends national interests or, you know, racial interests or, you know, different ethnicities caring about different groups. So how do we do this? Well, you know, we've got these differences, and the United States took it on in 1917. President Woodrow Wilson said, you know, we're going to make the world safe for democracy. Well, and that is another nice thought. But democracy and genocide don't really mesh. And the problem is, if you're following the rules, this will go away. The rules of humanity, the rules according to the UN. The problem of the rules, though, is the rules themselves. We've got Article 2 here of the Convention, and we've got a good definition. It's the best one we've come up with in 70 years of history to define these events. The problem is, though, there's another article, Article 8 of the Genocide Convention, adopted by the United Nations and all its members. I'm not going to read it to you, but it requires states not only to punish genocide, which, first off, demands a certain certainty that this is genocide. This is, in fact, what's going on. But it also, that member states, so the United Nations, are required to prevent and repress the crime, an action which requires premeditation. We need to know about it ahead of time to stop it, don't we? And this basically turns into preemptive action, which generally we don't arrest a murderer before he or she commits the crime, correct? I mean, unless we really know, unless the case has been built. In a lot of cases, these nations, look at, you know, these nations, it's not so easy. It's not so easy to call it and say that's what's going on here. So within the rules, there's a little bit of ambiguity. But again, we are, you know, the United Nations. Almost every nation on this earth is part of the United Nations, almost. And so we've got this requirement that member states will act in this way, to punish, to stop, and to repress. Those are all good things, right? You would think, again, another victory for the good guys. The problem is, in effect, and what has happened, is that requirement for nations to act, to stop these things, has created, unfortunately, many nations, including our own, simply saying, well, if it's not a genocide, we're not legally required to do anything about it. If it's ancient tribal hatred, if it's ethnic cleansing is a very popular term that comes out of these. If it's one of those, we don't have to do anything at all. We can say tisk tisk, that's too bad, and go about our days and play Xbox. Or go back to our economic trade deals, or whatever it is, you know, or debating taxes, as seems to be so popular these days. And that's, you know, what starts to happen, but it becomes glaringly, wrong button. Whoa, here we go. Sorry, folks. The best example I've got is Rwanda in 1994. This was a horrific event in which over 800,000 people, some sources say close to 1 million Rwandans, killed each other in a violent burst of about 100 days. Basically what happened was these two groups went at it, and we don't have to discuss why, that's not really what I'm talking about here, but was our reaction as the United States. We, our diplomats, our politicians, jumped through hoops to avoid the word genocide. We called it anything else. We didn't want to call it genocide. We even had military force on the ground. Remember I said military intervention is the only thing to stop these? We had a starter force that was there. There was a United Nations peacekeeping mission. There were paratroopers that went in to evacuate the expatriates. And there are 300 Marines just across the border in Burundi. We could have started. We could have stopped some of it. We did nothing. We debated genocide. Perhaps the most anger-inducing aspect, and I'm going to read you very briefly, was when Secretary of State Warren Christopher and his State Department staff, notably Christine Shelley, on transcript, all looked for different ways to describe these actions. If you'll excuse me for a moment. It comes notably in their press, speaking to the press. State Department, now I'm reading from, this is Problem from Hell, America in the Age of Genocide from Samantha Power, who is now our UN ambassador. State Department spokesperson Shelley returned to the podium on June 10th, 1994. By the way, June 10th, 1994, Rwanda's almost over. Challenged by a Reuters correspondent, Alan Elsner, she attempted to follow the secretary's guidance and, to avoid use of the word genocide. Elsner says, "How would you describe the events taking place in Rwanda?" Shelley, "Based on evidence we have seen from observations on the ground, we have every reason to believe that acts of genocide have occurred in Rwanda." Elsner, "What's the difference between acts of genocide and genocide?" Shelley, "Well, I think as you know, there's a legal definition of this. Clearly not all of the killings that have taken place in Rwanda are killings to which you might apply that label. But as to the distinction between the words, we're trying to call what we have seen so far as best we can, and based again on the evidence, we have every reason to believe that acts of genocide have occurred." Elsner, "How many acts of genocide does it take to make genocide?" Shelley, "Alan, that's just not a question that I'm in a position to answer." If that's not maddening enough, the very same day, Secretary of State Christopher says in a separate conference, if there is any particular magic in calling it genocide, I have no hesitancy in saying that. All of this while people died at the rate of over 6 a minute for 100 days. So what's all the point? What can we do? Well, I'm running a little bit out of time, so I'll make it quick. We have a past history of ignoring problems. The voyage of the St. Louis during the Holocaust, 900 Jews without entry papers off the coast of Miami. We sent them back to Germany. They will all get caught up in the Holocaust in various ways. It reminds me of today's refugee crisis in Europe. Over 2 million people are trying to get into Europe. The Obama administration has generously said we're going to take in, I believe, 100,000 over the next 2 years. It's a good start. But perhaps when you see these boats, these boats tip over and people drown, like the famous little boy in the top right. So what can we do? What can I do? I'm powerless. I can't stop this. Well, we do a good job of community service here at Madison. We do a good job of saying, hey guys, you have to make sure to remember not only your differences, but also what keeps us combined, what keeps our humanity. So basically, let's take those things seriously. Don't judge each other based on trivial labels and things that we look at each other in different ways. Try not to take those things, embrace our differences. Don't look at them as what divide us. Our differences unite us. We have a day of community service. Take it seriously. Go farther with it, right? We can help other people. I could also, right now, I feel like donating to these groups. And there's groups right there, Doctors Without Borders, Genocide Watch. The White House has aidrefugees.gov. Even joining the military. Our military dispenses so much human aid around the globe that it's a way to help. But again, what can I do here? Well, I think it really does start with just trying my best to not judge and to help other people. Serve. Do things for other people. Make it worth your while to engage other people. When we have our day of service, do it again. Come back the next week, wherever you are. Little things like that will help others. And you have to believe, maybe idealistically, that the more good in this world will counter the bad. There's an old Jewish proverb, and I'm probably misquoting, but it says something to the effect of, anyone who saves one life saves the whole world. I want you to think about that, because we're not trying to save all these millions of refugees or things like that. You really just need to help one person, and then you've helped. And it's a start. Thanks very much.
All right, all right.
Do we have time for questions?
We don't. Thank you very much, Mr. Bernich. Thank you all for coming out. Be sure to look forward to more Mad Talks in the future. And if you would like more information, the Madison Dodger Online has just that. And thank you very much. Have a good day.